The film opens with sweeping views of Stonemount Manor in the distance, perched on a jagged cliff high above a valley shrouded in mist. The mansion appears to be half swallowed by time, with ivy crawling over its stone exterior and the once proud windows now broken and dark. The moonlight cuts through the fog, creating an almost ethereal glow around the crumbling estate. Michael Langley, a businessman in his late 30s, surveys the scene from the front seat of his sleek car. His face is stern, set with the determination to finalize this deal no matter the cost. He's a man who thrives on success, but this time, something feels different. He isn't sure if it's the mansion's imposing presence or the unease settling in his chest, but he can't shake the feeling that something is watching him. Inside the manor, Elise Morrow, a driven architect in her early 30s, stands at the large oak door, waiting for Michael's arrival. The room around her is eerily quiet, save for the sound of the wind howling outside. She nervously pulls her coat tighter around her shoulders as the door creaks open. A gust of cold air slips in, and Elise instinctively steps backward, glancing at the long, dark hallway that stretches into the heart of the manor. The camera zooms in as the group drives deeper into the fog-covered valley. The mist wraps around the car like fingers reaching out to draw them in. Their headlights barely penetrate the thick fog, and the road twists and turns in unsettling directions. Elise watches from the window as the manor looms closer, its silhouette growing ever larger. As the car pulls up to the front of the house, a strange stillness fills the air. The manor stands as if frozen in time. The grand doors, despite the house's derelict state, creak open by themselves. A shiver runs down Elise's spine, but she shakes it off as mere superstition. Inside, the grandeur of Stonemount Manor is undeniable. It's filled with decaying opulence. Splendid tapestries still hang on the walls, although moth-eaten and dusty chandeliers still dangle from the high ceilings. Despite its dilapidation, the house feels almost alive with history, with whispers from the past. They enter, and the camera pans across the group, each member reacting differently to the atmosphere. Michael is unfazed, moving straight toward the grand staircase that spirals upwards. Elise, however, is unnerved, her fingers brushing along the banister as her eyes flicker to the shadows. Nathan, in his usual fashion, dismisses the place as a relic of the past, nothing more than an old building that will soon be turned into a profitable hotel. Harold keeps his eyes on the floor, murmuring a prayer under his breath, his grip on the crucifix around his neck tightening. They settle into their respective rooms, but an air of discomfort settles over them all. Elise, alone in her room, hears the faint sound of footsteps outside her door. She opens it, expecting to find someone standing there. But the hallway is empty, as cold as ever. She shakes it off as nothing, but the feeling that something is wrong gnaws at her. The next morning, the renovation team arrives, ready to begin work. They immediately encounter issues, tools that seem to vanish, strange noises emanating from behind the walls, and the unmistakable sound of something or someone scratching just beneath the surface of the plaster. One of the workers, Ben, a burly man, is the first to experience something truly horrifying. As he climbs the ladder to work on the second floor, a sudden force pushes him backward. His body crashes to the floor, his scream echoing through the empty halls. When the others rush to his side, they find him lying in a crumpled heap, his eyes wide with terror, but his body is oddly twisted. As he tries to speak, he mumbles, "It's inside the walls." Elise, standing near the door, watches in horror as the worker is carried out, his face pale, his body shaking uncontrollably. She notices something odd, a dark stain on the wall where Ben had fallen, but it's not blood. It's something deeper, darker, as if the walls themselves were bleeding. That night, Elise dreams vividly of an ancient woman, twisted with age, dragging a blood-stained knife across the floor. The floorboards creak as she moves, the sound echoing in Elise's dream. She wakes up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the image of the woman's hollow eyes haunting her mind. The renovation team continues working despite the mounting fear. As they begin tearing down the walls, they uncover a hidden room, one that wasn't on any of the original blueprints. The door, though sealed tight, is covered in strange symbols that seem to pulsate with a life of their own. The room inside is immaculate, untouched by time, and looks as though it was frozen in the 1920s. Dust motes dance in the shafts of light coming through the grimy windows. As the group explores the room, they notice the air is thick with an almost suffocating energy. Elise takes one step into the room, and her heart skips a beat as the temperature drops. The hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and for the first time she feels as though the house is watching her. Later that evening, one of the workers goes missing, vanished without a trace. Panic sets in as the group begins to search for him. The house seems to have changed overnight. Rooms that were once familiar are now twisted and unfamiliar. The hallways stretch on endlessly, doors lead to walls, and the windows show nothing but an endless void outside. Elise and the others begin to piece together the horrifying truth. Stonemount Manor is more than just a house. It's alive, a sentient entity that feeds on the fear and suffering of those who enter. Each room is a trap, each hallway a labyrinth that leads them deeper into its clutches. The whispers grow louder, and the oppressive atmosphere becomes unbearable. Elise, Michael, Nathan, and Sophia struggle to escape, but the manor's power only grows stronger as they uncover its dark history. Victor Grayson, the manor's original owner, was involved in cult rituals designed to summon a dark entity, and the house itself became a vessel for the creature's power. Harold, now in a state of near madness, pleads with the group to leave, but he is consumed by the house. His final moments are captured in a series of chilling screams as he is pulled into the walls. The house seems to swallow him whole. The group faces the terrifying truth. To escape, they must destroy the altar in the basement that binds the creature to the house. They descend into the bowels of Stonemount Manor, where they are confronted by the Hollow One, a monstrous entity composed of shifting souls, its face constantly changing between anguished expressions. Elise sets the altar ablaze, and the manor roars with fury. The house begins to collapse in on itself, the walls cracking, the floors crumbling. Elise and Michael barely make it out as the manor implodes. Weeks pass after Elise and Michael escape Stonemount Manor, the nightmare seemingly over. However, Elise's thoughts are haunted by the events that transpired. The memory of the house, its malevolent presence, and the terrifying truth she uncovered weigh heavily on her mind. Despite the destruction of the altar, something about the manor's influence lingers in the air. She is no longer the same woman who first entered the house, driven by ambition and curiosity. Now, her every step is shadowed by a dark premonition, as if the manor still calls to her. One foggy morning, Elise finds herself standing before the ruins of Stonemount Manor once again. The mansion's skeletal remains, though ravaged by the inferno they had set to destroy the altar, have begun to rebuild themselves. Cracks in the stone walls have sealed, and a faint, unnatural glow seems to emanate from the ruins. The oppressive silence that greets her is broken only by the sound of her breathing. She hesitates, feeling a pull she can't explain, almost like a whisper beckoning her to step inside. The more she fights it, the stronger it becomes. The manor has not finished with her yet. As Elise crosses the threshold of what remains of the manor, the air grows colder. The house feels alive again. The familiar corridors stretch endlessly before her. The haunting whispers, faint but unmistakable, begin to surround her. There is something here, something that never truly left. Her footsteps echo in the dark hallways as she searches for answers. In the dining room, an old portrait on the wall flickers, as though the face within it is trying to speak. The eyes of the painted figure seem to follow her every movement, their gaze filled with sorrow and malice. Elise's heart races as she remembers the stories. Stories of Victor Grayson, a man who dabbled in dark rituals to summon an entity that would make him immortal. She ventures deeper into the manor's heart. Every door she opens leads her to another layer of this twisted reality. The house seems to shift around her. It's as if it knows her every move. Watching, waiting, Elise finds herself in the very room where the altar once stood. But the altar is not destroyed. It has been rebuilt, dark and imposing, its sinister power pulsing with a new energy. The Hollow One, the entity bound to the house, materializes before her, its form a shifting mass of faces, each one tortured, each one full of longing. The Hollow One speaks in a voice that is both many and none. "You thought you destroyed me, it intones, its tone both mocking and sorrowful. But you cannot destroy what is eternal. I am the heart of Stonemount, and now I am reborn. The air thickens with dread as Elise faces the creature, her pulse pounding in her ears. She remembers the legends, the horrors that unfolded, and how they all seemed to revolve around the entity that resided within the walls of the manor. The Hollow One, bound by the ancient rituals of Victor Grayson, cannot be fully destroyed. It feeds on fear, on suffering, and now it hungers for Elise's soul. Suddenly, the manor around her begins to shift, its walls groaning in protest. The ground trembles and Elise feels a crushing weight, as if the very foundation of the house is trying to consume her. The Hollow One steps closer, its shifting form warping with each passing moment. In a desperate attempt to escape, Elise races through the halls, but the doors and windows seem to close themselves, sealing her fate. The house has become her prison. With every step, the whispers grow louder, more frantic, filling her mind with visions of death and madness. She can see Michael's face, contorted in fear, his body trapped inside the manor's labyrinth forever. Elise realizes the truth. There is no escape. The house is not just a structure, but a living, breathing entity. She and the others were never meant to leave. They were part of a ritual that could never truly be undone. The Hollow One's resurrection is the final step in Victor Grayson's dark legacy. Elise knows what must be done. The only way to end the nightmare is to offer herself to the Hollow One, to become its vessel. She will sacrifice herself to destroy the entity once and for all, ending the cycle that has cursed the manor for centuries. As she steps forward, the Hollow One reaches out to claim her. Its face shifts, now showing a twisted image of Victor Grayson's visage, his eyes pleading for her to join him. Elise takes a deep breath, feeling the cold touch of inevitability wash over her. She closes her eyes, accepting the darkness that awaits. In a flash of light, Elise merges with the Hollow One. Her form is consumed by the creature, and for a moment, it seems as if she will be lost forever. But then a surge of energy erupts from within her, an explosion of light and power that tears through the manor's walls. The house begins to crumble, its structure collapsing into nothingness as the dark entity is finally destroyed. The echoes of the manor's screams fade, leaving only silence. Months later, a lone figure walks through the valley where Stonemount Manor once stood. The fog has lifted and the land is quiet, peaceful even. There are no signs of the house, no remnants of its twisted power. The only thing that remains is the feeling that something ancient and malevolent once lived here, and now it is gone. Elise is gone, but her sacrifice is not forgotten. The land where Stonemount stood is now free, though the memory of the house will forever linger in the hearts of those who survived its horrors. The valley is peaceful, but deep in the earth, something still stirs. A faint whisper carried on the wind, reminding the world that some things can never truly be erased. The Harper family had been searching for the perfect home for months. After a tragic year marked by the sudden death of Sarah's father, the couple sought a place that would help them move forward, away from the painful memories of their old life. They found it in an unexpected place, an old, sprawling mansion on the outskirts of a sleepy rural town. The estate was almost an enigma. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning the Harpers to steer clear of the house. But Sarah and Michael, both of whom had a penchant for history and charm, dismissed the whispers. They were excited, optimistic, and eager to start fresh. As they drove up the long, winding driveway, the mansion came into view. The house, built in the 1800s, stood tall and proud amidst overgrown ivy and decaying stone walls. It looked like something out of a Victorian novel, with its high, arched windows and looming spires that scraped the sky. It was like a piece of history, frozen in time. Perfect, but something about it felt wrong. The windows reflected nothing but the dark sky, and the air was unnaturally still. The sounds of birds, usually so prominent in the countryside, were absent, replaced by an eerie silence. Still, the Harpers, eager to move in, brushed the unease aside. They unpacked their things and immediately set to work on making the house feel like home. The house seemed to welcome them, albeit with an unsettling stillness. As Sarah placed a vase on the grand dining table, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. but she pushed it aside, reminding herself it was just her nerves. The first few nights were uneventful, though Sarah couldn't help but notice the faint flicker of lights at odd hours, and the peculiar way the shadows seemed to shift. On the fourth day of their stay, Emma, the younger daughter, first mentioned the attic mirror. "Mom, there's something about that mirror in the attic," Emma whispered one evening as she prepared for bed. "It's like it's staring at me. I don't like it." Sarah, somewhat dismissive but curious, promised her daughter they would move the mirror the next day. But when Sarah went to investigate the attic the next morning, the sight of the large ornate mirror sent a shiver down her spine. It was stunning, an antique with a gilded frame, exquisitely designed, but there was something off about it. The glass was almost unnervingly clear, reflecting everything around it with sharp, unsettling precision. Sarah felt an immediate, growing unease as she stood before the mirror. It was as if the glass wasn't just reflecting the room, it was absorbing it. The dust, the cobwebs, the old furniture, all of it seemed to be consumed by the reflection, becoming more vivid, more alive. It wasn't just a mirror, it was as though it was showing a different reality. She walked closer, her eyes locked with her reflection, but as she did, a soft scraping sound came from the glass. At first it was so faint she thought it was the wind, but then it became more distinct, louder, more deliberate. Her pulse quickened. Suddenly the reflection shifted. Sarah blinked, her eyes going wide. The image in the mirror was not hers. The woman standing in the reflection was older, her face twisted in terror, her hands trembling as she looked over her shoulder, as though something was following her. "Michael!" Sarah cried out, stumbling backward, her voice tinged with panic. Her husband came running into the attic, his eyes darting toward the mirror. But when he saw it, the reflection was gone. The woman had disappeared, replaced by the empty attic room, just as it should be. But the tension in the room remained, thick and suffocating. "Nothing there," Michael said, his voice steady but his eyes uneasy. "But Michael, it was there. I saw it. I swear it," Sarah whispered, still shaken. She knew what she had seen, but in that moment, doubt crept into her mind. Over the next few days, strange things began to unfold. At night, Sarah would wake up to the sound of scratching, faint at first, but unmistakably there. The sound was coming from behind the walls, as if something was trying to claw its way out. At first, she attributed it to the house settling, to the old wood and plaster groaning under the pressure. But then she noticed the whispers. In the dead of night, soft murmurs filled the air. It was as though the house itself was alive, its very walls communicating with something or someone beyond their reach. Every corner of the house felt like it was breathing, watching, but it was the mirror that continued to haunt Sarah's every thought. The whispering intensified, growing louder each day. The whispers were joined by faint, scratchy noises, like fingers dragging across glass. And whenever Sarah would pass the attic door, she felt a strange compulsion to look inside, to approach the mirror. One afternoon, Michael was in the living room when Ethan rushed in, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, I saw something in the mirror. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't me. It was someone else. Someone angry." Sarah's blood ran cold. Ethan, always so level-headed, was visibly shaken. He had seen it too. Whatever was inside that mirror, whatever was trapped in that glass, was starting to make its presence known. But the next day, when Sarah went to the attic to check, the mirror seemed fine. No reflection, no strange woman, nothing. She tried to convince herself it was just the house's eccentricities. It was an old house after all, but deep down she knew the truth. Whatever was in that mirror was not just a reflection. Days turned into weeks, and the presence in the house grew stronger. The strange events became harder to ignore. The family's sleep was disturbed by the incessant scratching and the whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Michael began having vivid nightmares of being trapped in the attic with the mirror, of seeing Evelyn Abernathy's twisted face staring back at him, her mouth moving, but no words coming out. Each time he woke up, he would find himself cold and drenched in sweat. As the days wore on, Emma became obsessed with the mirror. She would sit in front of it for hours, staring at her own reflection with an expression that terrified Sarah. She wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink. Her gaze was unwavering. And yet Emma began speaking of someone, the woman in the glass. "She told me to stay," Emma would whisper, her voice distant. "She said she's lonely. She needs me." Each time Sarah tried to intervene, Emma would withdraw further, her obsession growing stronger. But the rest of the family, Michael included, dismissed it as mere imagination. Still, there was a shift in the atmosphere of the house. It felt heavier, darker. The house itself seemed to change. The creaks and groans grew louder. The rooms, once welcoming, now felt suffocating. The air was thick with a palpable energy, as though something unseen was closing in on them. The mirror was the focal point of it all, pulling them toward it. Sarah, Michael, and even Ethan found themselves inexplicably drawn to it. They knew they shouldn't, but they couldn't look away. The whispers became more urgent. The scratching became relentless. And then one evening, the mirror began to glow. It wasn't a faint light. It was bright, blinding, pulsing with dark energy. The house trembled as the mirror's surface shimmered, distorting the reflections. The walls groaned, and the floor beneath them buckled as though the house itself was being torn apart. In that moment, Sarah realized that they were no longer in control. Whatever was trapped in the mirror was trying to escape. The glow from the mirror intensified, casting long, twisting shadows across the attic. Sarah's heart raced as she stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to look away. It was as if the mirror itself was breathing, pulsing with a life of its own. Her mind screamed for her to leave, to take her family and run, but her body refused to obey. Then the glass began to warp. The edges curled and bent, distorting the reflection as though it were liquid. The image of the woman, the twisted, anguished figure, began to bleed through, her face now fully visible, her eyes locked onto Sarah's. "She's coming," the voice whispered, a hoarse, guttural sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You cannot escape." The walls trembled as though in response, shaking with a violent force. The attic door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. She stumbled backward, her hands flying to her face as she tried to block out the sight of the mirror. But it was too late. The reflection was no longer a simple reflection. The woman's hand reached out from the mirror, her fingers curling around the glass, pressing against it as though trying to break through. Sarah screamed, the sound echoing through the house, but no one came. No one could hear her. The temperature in the attic dropped drastically. The once warm air turned icy cold, and Sarah could see her breath in front of her. As she backed away, she felt something shift in the air. Michael had been searching the house for Sarah when he heard her frantic scream. He ran toward the attic, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind filled with dread. When he reached the top of the stairs, the door was slammed shut. The sound of someone, scratching against the wood from the other side. "Sarah, Sarah, open the door!" he shouted, panic in his voice. But there was no response. The only sound was the eerie scraping, like nails dragged across a stone. He turned the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The air in the attic seemed thicker now, suffocating. He tried again, and this time it opened. Inside, he found Sarah, her eyes wide with terror. She was trembling, her hand pointing toward the mirror. "They're in there, Michael! They're all in there!" she cried, her voice frantic. Michael's gaze shifted to the mirror, and his stomach dropped. The woman in the reflection was no longer alone. Behind her, dozens of figures, shadowy, faceless, stood, their eyes fixed on him. The air felt heavy, thick with malevolent energy. "They've been waiting for us," Sarah whispered. "And now they want us." Michael stepped back, pulling Sarah with him, but the floor seemed to buckle beneath their feet. The house groaned in protest as though it were alive, its walls closing in on them. The mirrors began to glow brighter, their surface rippling as though it were water. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind them with an explosion of sound, and the walls of the house began to shake violently. "We need to get out!" Sarah screamed, grabbing Michael's arm. But as they turned to run, the mirror seemed to grow larger, its frame expanding until it consumed the entire attic. The reflections in the mirror began to step forward, out of the glass, their cold, lifeless eyes fixed on Michael and Sarah. They reached out toward them, their fingers brushing against the glass, reaching for the living. Michael's heart raced as he tried to think of an escape, but there was no way out. The air around them crackled with dark energy. and the whispers grew into a cacophony of voices. In that moment, the mirror shattered, its glass splintering into thousands of shards that rained down around them. But even as the mirror broke, the spirits, no longer bound to the glass, began to manifest in full. Sarah felt an ice-cold hand wrap around her ankle. She screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened. Michael lunged to help her, but it was too late. A figure, tall and thin, with black, soulless eyes and a mouth that stretched impossibly wide, emerged from the shattered mirror. It hissed as it moved, its fingers clawing at the floor as it advanced on them. The house seemed to pulse with the entities now free from the mirror's grasp, and the walls seemed to close in as their cries filled the air. "Sarah! Michael!" the voice screamed, but it was not their own. It was the voice of the woman from the mirror, twisted, fractured. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house and the back door of the attic slammed open, sending a gust of wind through the room. The spirits hesitated, their eyes darting toward the new opening. It was their only chance. "Run!" Michael shouted, pulling Sarah toward the exit. They bolted through the door, crashing down the staircase, their feet barely touching the steps as they ran. The house seemed to chase them, the floor beneath their feet shaking violently as if it wanted to swallow them whole. They raced through the halls, the whispers and the scratching growing louder until they finally burst through the front door. The air outside felt like a breath of fresh life, though the terror from the house clung to them. They didn't stop running until they reached their car, but even then, as they drove away, they could still hear the whispers. They could still feel the cold fingers brushing against the skin. Months later, Sarah and Michael had moved far away from the mansion, trying to leave the horrors of the house behind them. They never spoke of the mirror again, but they couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with them. Every so often, Sarah would catch a glimpse of her reflection in a window, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. And every time she did, she would find herself wondering, was the woman in the mirror really gone? Because in the stillness of the night, when everything was quiet, Sarah could still hear the whispers. And she was never quite sure if they were in her head or if they were coming from something much, much darker. The end. Lena and Jason were over the moon about their new house. They had just received the keys to the beautiful Victorian home, and the couple couldn't wait to settle in. The house had always been an object of their dreams. Its towering architecture, intricate woodwork, and large windows offered a picturesque view of the surrounding woods. But what intrigued them most was its history. The house had been vacant for years, with no other family having lived there for decades. The price was far below what they expected, considering its size and charm. It seemed too good to be true, but there was something about it that felt right. Perhaps it was the thought of starting their family here that made them feel so at ease. When they first stepped inside, everything seemed perfect, old but well-preserved, with the distinct aroma of aged wood and faint traces of what once was. As they wandered through the rooms, the silence was overwhelming. It was a kind of silence that felt suffocating, as though the house was waiting for something. Jason quickly went to work setting up their furniture, while Lena began picturing the nursery for their baby. She imagined painting the walls a soft yellow, filling the room with stuffed animals and pastel curtains. But as Lena started unpacking baby clothes, she noticed something strange, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere hanging over the house. Every time she stepped into the nursery, she felt a coldness seep into her bones. She could never quite shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. At night, the sounds of the house settling were unnerving, the creaks and groans of old wood becoming louder with each passing hour. The long, unbroken silence was broken only by the distant thrum of wind. And yet, Lena felt as if someone was always watching her. She pushed the thoughts aside, believing it was just her nerves. But deep down, she knew that there was something more. By the time they had moved all their belongings in, Lena had begun to prepare the nursery. She spent hours making the room feel like a safe haven for their unborn child. Soft curtains billowed with the faint breeze from the window. The crib was placed by the large window, offering a panoramic view of the neglected garden, its vines creeping toward the house like long, skeletal fingers. But strange things began to happen. Late one evening, when Jason was out running errands, Lena sat alone in the nursery, quietly sorting through baby items. The room felt still, almost too still. Then she heard it, a soft giggle, like the sound of a child playing just out of reach. Lena froze. The sound had come from within the room, but when she turned to look, there was nothing. She turned toward the window, expecting to see the reflection of a bird or a breeze playing tricks on her, but there was nothing, just the empty nursery. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for the sound to return. Her skin crawled and goosebumps rose along her arms. But nothing more happened, and after a while she forced herself to stand and leave the room. It was only after she was safely back in the living room, breathing deeply to calm herself, that the giggle returned. This time it was louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Small, hurried, like a child running. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she tried to convince herself it was the wind or a trick of her imagination. But deep down, she knew it was something far worse. The following days were a blur of conflicting emotions. Lena tried to ignore the strange happenings, chalking them up to the stresses of pregnancy and the move. But each time she stepped into the nursery, the air seemed heavier, colder. She couldn't help but notice that things felt wrong in the room. Objects slightly out of place, shadows that moved on their own. One afternoon while Jason was at work, Lena decided to explore the attic. She had always wanted to learn more about the house's history. The attic was filled with old furniture, covered in dusty sheets, broken frames, and faded wallpaper. But as she sifted through the clutter, she found something unsettling: a photograph. The photo was old, black and white, depicting a family standing in front of the house, much as it appeared now. But there was a child in the background, standing alone near the nursery window. Lena's heart skipped a beat. The child's eyes were dull, empty, like they were staring right at her from the photo. She turned the photo over, hoping for an explanation, and saw that someone had written on the back, "The child never left, forever bound to the nursery." Her fingers trembled as she set the photo down. Was it some kind of sick joke, or was there a deeper truth behind the image? What was more disturbing was that the child in the photograph looked almost exactly like the giggling child she had heard. Lena couldn't ignore the connection anymore. She needed to know more, and she needed to find out who the child was. After a sleepless night, Lena decided to visit the local library to dig deeper into the history of the house. What she found was far more horrifying than she could have imagined. The house had once been owned by the Hargrave family, an old money family known for their wealth and prestige. They had lived in the house for over 50 years before tragedy struck. Lena uncovered the tragic story of Mary Hargrave, the family's young daughter. Mary had been just a baby when she disappeared from her crib one fateful night. The Hargraves had been devastated by the disappearance, but no trace of the child was ever found. The police had searched for days, scouring the house, the grounds, and the nearby woods. But no one had ever seen Mary again. The Hargraves, broken by the loss, moved away shortly afterward, and the house was sold. The new owners never stayed long. Each family that came after had reported disturbing experiences: noises in the night, cold spots, objects that moved on their own. But most disturbing of all were the sightings of a small child in the window, staring out from the nursery. The story sent a chill down Lena's spine. She had found the missing piece. The child in the photo, the child in the nursery, was Mary Hargrave, and her spirit had never left the house. The manifestations began to intensify. Lena could no longer deny that something in the house was not right. She began hearing Mary's voice, soft and distant, whispering her name in the middle of the night. Sometimes Lena would wake up to see shadows moving across the walls, twisted shapes that seemed to reach for her, trying to pull her back into the dark. The giggles came more frequently. In the nursery, the temperature would drop so suddenly that her breath would fog in the air. When she looked into the reflection of the crib, she sometimes saw a small face staring back at her, only to turn around and find the room empty. Jason, who had been dismissive of the occurrences at first, began to experience them as well. He woke one night to hear the sound of a child crying. When he went to check, he found the nursery door locked tight. The crying grew louder, more frantic, as if it were coming from inside the walls. Lena's fear turned to dread. She knew they were not alone. They were being haunted by the restless spirit of Mary Hargrave, and she was not content to simply watch. She wanted something, something that could only be given to her. The final night came like a slow, inevitable storm. Lena could no longer bear the terror that had taken root in the house. She felt like she was being consumed by it. The cries of Mary echoed through the halls, growing louder and more desperate. The walls seemed to close in on her. Lena decided to confront the spirit. Armed with nothing but her courage, she entered the nursery one last time. The giggling stopped. The room grew unnervingly still, the air heavy with malevolent energy. She stood before the crib, staring down at it, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The door slammed shut behind her, trapping her inside. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room was completely dark. When the lights came back on, Lena saw Mary. She stood in the corner of the room, her pale face twisted in rage. Her mouth opened wide, emitting a sound so deafening that it rattled the windows. Mary reached out, her cold fingers brushing Lena's cheek. "You took my place," Mary whispered, her voice a shrill, guttural tone. "Now you will stay." Lena screamed, trying to run, but the ghostly child grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the crib. It was then that Lena realized what she had feared all along. Mary's spirit wanted to claim her unborn child. It wanted to take the baby's place. With a surge of adrenaline, Lena broke free, knocking over a chair in the process. She scrambled to the door, opening it just enough to escape. Jason, hearing her cries, rushed in and grabbed her, pulling her out of the room. The couple rushed to escape, feeling the oppressive weight of the nursery room behind them. Jason grabbed Lena by the arm, pulling her down the narrow hallway toward the stairs. But as they ran, the house seemed to shift around them. The walls stretched and bent, the once familiar path now a labyrinth that twisted their way. Every door they tried to open was locked. Every window was sealed. The house itself seemed to grow larger, swallowing them whole. The lights flickered wildly, and the sounds of crying, whispers, and footsteps echoed from every corner. It felt as though the house was alive, pulsating with an ancient, dark energy that sought to trap them forever. In a panic, Lena and Jason reached the front door. It should have been their escape, but when they tried to turn the handle, it refused to budge. The door groaned as if some unseen force was holding it shut. Behind them, the air grew colder, the footsteps growing louder. Mary's shrill voice echoed through the halls. "You can't leave. You belong here." With each passing second, the temperature dropped, frost creeping across the floor. The walls seemed to close in around them, the house tightening its grip. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, and Lena was on the verge of breaking down. But just as hope seemed lost, Lena noticed something, a figure standing in the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was an older man, pale, with a gaunt face and eyes that glimmered with sadness. His clothes were old-fashioned, reminiscent of the house's former residents. Lena's blood ran cold when she realized who he was. It was the father of the Hargrave family, standing as if he had been waiting for them all along. His ghostly form was translucent, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he was a part of the very walls of the house. "You must leave," the ghost said, his voice raspy and broken. "She will never let you go. You must break the cycle." Lena and Jason were frozen with fear, unable to move as the spirit of the father stepped forward. With a trembling hand, he reached out to touch the door. When he did, the wood seemed to crack, and a soft, eerie glow emanated from the cracks. "The house has always held its victims," the spirit continued, his voice filled with sorrow. "But now there is a way to stop her. If you can face her, if you can break the curse." Suddenly, the door swung open, the oppressive cold lifting. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its presence lightening for a moment. But in that moment of freedom, Lena could hear Mary's voice one final time, filled with anguish. "No one leaves!" Jason and Lena wasted no time. They ran through the open door into the night, the house's shadows stretching toward them, as if they were reaching out to reclaim them. As they sprinted down the overgrown path, the house loomed behind them, its windows dark and watching. They didn't dare look back. As they reached the end of the driveway, Jason and Lena turned to look at the house one last time. The eerie glow from within flickered, and they could almost see Mary's figure standing in the window. her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted in an eternal scream. The house stood still, waiting for its next victims. But for now, Lena and Jason had escaped. They had broken the curse, but they would never forget the terror of that night, the ghostly whispers, the giggles of the lost child, and the cold touch of Mary Hargrave's spirit. Sophia Ellis had always felt drawn to antiques. From the time she was a little girl, she spent hours wandering through flea markets, estate sales, and auction houses, her eyes glinting with the thrill of uncovering forgotten treasures. There was something about old, weathered objects, their history, their secrets, that fascinated her. It was almost as if, in owning them, she could briefly step into the shoes of those who came before her. But there was one thing Sophia never anticipated, an object that would hold her, body and soul, in its vice-like grip. On a dreary autumn day, in the sleepy, forgotten town of Whitmore Falls, Sophia came upon an estate sale that seemed unlike any other. The house itself was an ancient relic, a crumbling Victorian mansion nestled on the outskirts of town. The moment she stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavy, and oppressive. Dust clung to everything like a shroud, and the wood creaked underfoot with every step. The entire atmosphere had an unsettling, almost haunted quality to it. And then, in the heart of the living room, she saw it, a dollhouse. Not just any dollhouse, but a meticulously crafted, darkly beautiful miniature mansion. Its dark wood was carved with intricate details, its glass windows reflecting the dim light in the room. The furniture inside was antique, and the figures, the porcelain dolls, seemed so lifelike that Sophia felt a chill as she gazed at them. There was a certain unsettling charm to the piece, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. The elderly woman selling the estate watches her from a corner, her pale eyes narrowing, her voice trembling, cut through the silence. "That there is not just a dollhouse," she warned, the words barely above a whisper. "It belonged to the Durham family, to the two little girls, Emily and Grace. There are stories about that house, stories that aren't for the faint of heart." Sophia felt the blood drain from her face as the old woman spoke. But despite the warning, an odd, insatiable curiosity began to burn in her chest. She'd always wanted to own a piece of history, a true artifact. And this dollhouse, it seemed to call to her in a way that nothing else ever had. Without a second thought, she made her purchase. The dollhouse felt heavy as Sophia carried it into her apartment, the ornate details seeming almost to pulse with a strange energy. Her apartment was modest, an eclectic mix of vintage furniture and soft lighting, but it was hers. It was here that she hoped to finally feel at peace after a long and taxing week at work. As the dollhouse settled on her coffee table, she couldn't help but feel the pull of its dark beauty. She studied it for a moment, taking in the fine details of the dolls inside. Two young girls, porcelain skin glowing under the low light, their expressions serene yet vacant. That night, as she lay in bed, she heard it. Whispers. Soft, so soft. They barely seemed real. Sophia sat up, straining to listen. At first, she thought it was the wind outside, the rustling of branches scraping against her window. But then the whispers grew louder, distinct. "Come play with us. Come play with us, Sophia." She froze, paralyzed in bed. The voice sounded like a child's, but warped, distorted, as if it were coming from the depths of the dollhouse itself. When she rushed into the living room, the room was still. The dollhouse sat silently on the coffee table. There was no movement, no sound. Sophia shook her head. She had imagined it. She had to have imagined it. She was exhausted, that's all. But when she looked closer at the dolls, her breath caught in her throat. They weren't positioned as they had been earlier. The porcelain girls were no longer standing side by side. Instead, they had turned, one of them looking toward the doorway, its eyes fixed on her. The days that followed were filled with strange occurrences. The whispers did not stop. Every night they grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes they were clear, calling her name. Other times they were faint giggles, the tinkling sound of children's laughter echoing through the apartment. Sophia tried to ignore it, chalking it up to her mind playing tricks on her. But then the changes began. The dolls moved again. She was certain of it. Every time she walked into the room, they were arranged differently. The little girl in the tattered blue dress was now sitting at the edge of a tiny, ornate bed, her face twisted in an almost unnatural expression of joy. The other girl, in a pristine white dress, was standing with her back to the room, her head tilted at a disturbing angle. One evening when Sophia entered her apartment, the air felt different, cold, unnatural. She reached for the doorknob, and before her hand even made contact, the door slammed shut. Panicked, she turned to see that the dolls were no longer on the table. They were now standing in a perfect line, facing the door, their eyes glowing. A soft breeze blew through the apartment, even though the windows were shut tight. "Help us! Join us!" The dolls whispered in eerie unison. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, her legs shaking. This is just a dream. This can't be real." But deep down she knew it was real, and it was only just beginning. Desperation led Sophia to the town library. She buried herself in the dusty shelves, combing through old records and town history. It didn't take long before she found the records of the Durham family. The family had been prominent in Whitmore Falls, well-known and well-loved, but their wealth couldn't save them from the tragedy that would forever mark their legacy. The two daughters, Emily and Grace, were believed to have drowned in the family's lake one summer. However, the official report noted something strange. The girls were found, but there was no sign of the cause of death. The family had been devastated, of course, but there were whispers that suggested something darker was at play. Sophia's hands trembled as she read on. Some believed the Durhams had resorted to occult practices to communicate with their lost daughters. They had sought out a spirit medium who promised them a way to bring Emily and Grace back. The dolls had been part of the ritual, a vessel for the girls' souls. But instead of peace, the girls' spirits had become trapped in the dolls, their souls restless and twisted. One entry from an old journal caught Sophia's eye, the final warning. Once the dolls have been awakened, they will seek a new soul, a new vessel, and they will never stop until they have claimed one. Sophia closed the book with trembling hands, her stomach twisted in knots. The whispers became more urgent, the dolls more aggressive. Sophia could no longer sleep in peace. The air in her apartment was always heavy with an unseen presence. She could feel the dolls watching her, waiting. Then, one fateful night, it happened. Sophia entered the living room, only to find the dollhouse had changed once again. The dolls were no longer seated but had gathered in a circle. Their faces were blank, yet their eyes, those glassy, lifeless eyes, seemed to be staring directly at her. The temperature in the room plummeted. A sharp, biting cold wrapped around her, and she could see her breath in front of her. One by one, the dolls began to speak in unison, their voices overlapping. "Come play with us, Sophia." She stumbled back, her heart racing, her breath shallow. She tried to flee, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire building. The dolls, now fully animated, seemed to move on their own. They twitched, their heads turning toward her. The porcelain figures began to shudder, as though they were trying to escape their tiny wooden prison. The room began to darken, the lights flickering and dying as a low growl rumbled from the walls. Sophia turned to face the door, but the dollhouse seemed to suck all the light from the room. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then, in the corner of her eye, she saw them. Two ghostly figures, pale and translucent, appeared in the doorway. The faces of Emily and Grace, twisted in eternal sorrow, stared at her, their mouths moving, their voices rising in a chilling chant. "Help us! Join us!" Sophia's legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. The walls seemed to close in on her, the very air pulsating with the, "It seems you're aiming for a deeply extended and intricate version of the haunting of the dollhouse story. This would be far more involved than what I can provide in one response due to length limitations. But I can help you get started by continuing from where the previous part left off, adding more depth, atmosphere, and psychological tension." The tension in the air was thick as Chloe, trembling, placed her hand on the dusty doorknob of the dollhouse room. It had been hours since the lights flickered. Hours since they'd heard whispers from within the walls, soft, sinister murmurs that seemed to echo in every corner of the house. The unsettling noise continued in the background, even now, like an incessant buzzing that only they could hear. "Chloe, I don't want to go in there," Sarah whispered, gripping Chloe's arm. Her voice was barely above a breath, but it carried a weight of pure fear. "This place, it's not just old. It's wrong." Chloe nodded, the coldness of the metal handle seeping through her palm, but she had to face it. She couldn't leave her friends behind to deal with whatever this place was. The secrets it held were clawing at the edges of her mind. Before Chloe could say anything, the door creaked open on its own. A gust of frigid air hit her face, carrying the musty smell of age and decay. The room beyond was cloaked in darkness, save for the faintest slivers of light spilling in from the hallway. As the door fully opened, Chloe stepped inside. The room seemed to stretch before her, and every corner was filled with shadows. The walls were lined with antique furniture, covered in thick, faded sheets. In the center of the room sat the dollhouse, its intricate details barely visible in the dim light. The windows were shuttered tight, keeping any light from the outside world from entering. "Look at this," Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. She slowly moved toward the dollhouse, her steps measured and cautious. "It's like it's been waiting for us." As she reached out to touch the wooden frame, a jolt of electricity shot through her, as if the house itself had woken up at her touch. Her fingers froze for a moment before she yanked her hand back, but it was too late. In an instant, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The air grew heavier, thicker. The temperature seemed to plummet. A deep groan reverberated through the walls, and the floorboards creaked as though something was moving beneath them. Chloe felt her heart pounding, the terror gnawing at her insides. Sarah grabbed her by the arm. "Chloe, we need to get out of here, now!" But Chloe was transfixed by the dollhouse. There was something about it, something in its design, in the way it called to her, that she couldn't resist. The miniature figures inside the house were arranged as if frozen in time, each of them staring out from their tiny windows. They were eerily lifelike, their faces twisted in expressions of horror and despair. But what really drew Chloe's attention was a figure in the window of the top floor. Its small hand pressed to the glass, the figure of a child. The child's face was pale, almost translucent, but what struck Chloe the hardest were its eyes. They were wide, staring directly at her, and Chloe felt an unnatural chill run down her spine. "Chloe!" Sarah screamed again, tugging harder at her arm. "Get away from it!" But it was too late. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing from all directions, their voices scraping against Chloe's mind like nails on a chalkboard. They were no longer unintelligible murmurs, but distinct words. Words that burrowed deep into her consciousness. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was cold, detached, as if it were speaking from within the very walls of the room. Chloe stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her, but she couldn't look away from the dollhouse. The child in the window, it was gone. In that instant, the entire house seemed to tremble. The lights flickered again, and the air thickened as if the house itself were breathing, alive with dark energy. Suddenly, the dolls in the dollhouse moved. Chloe blinked, unable to believe what she was seeing. The tiny figures, once frozen in their positions, began to twitch. One by one, their limbs twitched and jerked, and their eyes, those glassy, lifeless eyes, shifted to stare directly at Chloe. She screamed, but the sound was drowned out by a rush of wind that howled through the room. "Chloe, let's go!" Sarah screamed, pulling her toward the door, but Chloe couldn't move. It was as though the house had rooted her in place, its power holding her captive. The dolls began to climb out of the dollhouse, their tiny hands reaching for Chloe. One by one, they stepped out, their porcelain faces cracking and breaking as they moved. Each of them wore expressions of twisted agony, their features contorted as if they had been forced to live in pain for eternity. Chloe felt something cold touch her shoulder. She whipped around, but there was nothing there, except for a shadow, too large and too dark to be cast by the dim light. The whispers returned, but this time, they were louder, clearer. "We want you to stay." Suddenly, Chloe's vision blurred, and the world around her seemed to warp. The room, the walls, the dolls, they all seemed to stretch and distort, as if she were falling into a void. With a final desperate scream, Chloe broke free from the house's hold, her legs shaking as she ran toward the door. Sarah was waiting for her, pulling her into the hallway as the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. The two of them stood there, panting, the eerie whispers still ringing in their ears. But as they looked back at the dollhouse room, the door was now sealed shut. There was no sign of the dolls, no indication that anything had ever been there. "What the hell just happened?" Sarah gasped, eyes wide with fear. What were those things?" Chloe couldn't answer. She was too terrified, too shaken to speak. But as she looked back one last time at the door, she swore she saw the child's face, pressed against the tiny window in the dollhouse, staring back at her. And then, just as suddenly as it had all begun, everything fell silent. For days, the house seemed to return to its quiet, lifeless state. But Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows, something waiting, something watching. The whispers never truly stopped, and Chloe knew deep down that the house wasn't done with them yet. Story number 5, The Haunting of Ashford Hills. Ashford Hills wasn't just a town, it was a place steeped in dark, twisted history, as old as the mountains that surrounded it. The town's existence was tied to the cursed mansion that sat on the hill, watching over the settlement with malevolent eyes. Over the years, rumors about Ashford House became legends, passed down like ghost stories told to children to warn them from straying too far from home. But no one dared to speak of it, and no one truly believed the tales, until they arrived. When Sarah Whitaker, an experienced paranormal investigator, decided to bring her team to Ashford Hills, she did so with one objective in mind: to uncover the truth about the Ashford family's mysterious disappearance. No one had seen them for over a century, and yet the mansion remained untouched, as if it were frozen in time. The mansion's crumbling walls spoke of years of neglect and decay, but even in its disrepair, Ashford House was imposing. Its shadows stretched long and dark over the town, as if the house were watching, waiting for someone to dare enter. The house stood on the highest point in Ashford Hills, hidden behind dense woods that seemed almost too thick for anyone to pass through. The path leading to the house was narrow, overgrown with weeds and brambles, as if nature itself was trying to keep intruders away. The locals spoke of the house with hushed voices, their faces pale when Sarah asked questions. They warned her, there are things in that house that no one should ever see. But Sarah was determined to face the unknown. She gathered her team, James, the tech expert, Emily, the psychic, and Michael, the skeptic, and made their way to the infamous mansion. They didn't know it yet, but as soon as they crossed the threshold, they would become part of Ashford House's story. The team arrived at dusk, the sky a deep purple that was almost unnatural in its hue. The house loomed in the distance, its tall, Gothic structure like a dark silhouette against the sky. A sense of unease hung in the air, and Emily shuddered as they approached. "I have a bad feeling about this place," Emily whispered, her hand brushing against the rough stone wall of the mansion's entrance, as if to steady herself. James, rolling his eyes, adjusted the equipment bag on his shoulder. "Don't be so dramatic, Emily. We've been in worse places." But Emily's unease only grew as they crossed the threshold. Inside, the mansion was unnervingly silent. The floors creaked underfoot, and the air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. Their flashlights flickered against the walls, casting erratic shadows that danced like phantom figures. Sarah, who was always the leader in situations like these, led the way. "Stay sharp. We're here to document everything and get answers. Stay together and stay focused." But the closer they came to the center of the mansion, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Emily felt a presence, like invisible eyes were watching them from the dark corners of the house. The temperature began to drop, and an icy draft seemed to follow them no matter where they went. When they reached the grand living room, Sarah was the first to notice the strange, cold portrait that hung on the wall. The portrait was old, almost ancient. It depicted the Ashford family, but something about the painting was wrong. The mother, her dark eyes fixed on the viewer, looked more like a predator than a matron. The father's face was stern, as if he knew something the others didn't, and the children, especially the youngest girl, seemed to stare out of the painting as if pleading for someone to understand their pain. "I've never seen anything like this," Sarah murmured as she stepped closer. "It's as though they're not just posing for a portrait. It's like they're trapped in that moment." Emily, her eyes wide, stood frozen in front of the painting. "They're trapped. Not just in the painting. The house, it's alive." The moment she said those words, the temperature dropped further. The walls seemed to grow colder, as if the house itself were exhaling its breath, creating a suffocating atmosphere. But the most chilling part was the faint sound of whispering, low voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice shaky. "I didn't hear anything," James replied, though his voice had a tremor of uncertainty now. The whispers grew louder. There was a distinct word, "leave," carried on the wind, but no one had moved. It wasn't just an echo or a breeze. It felt like a warning, something more sinister. "We should get out of here," Emily said, her voice low and urgent. But before anyone could respond, the chandelier hanging above them began to shake, its glass crystals clinking together like broken teeth. Sarah turned to the team, her eyes wide with realization. "We're not alone in this house." As they continued deeper into the mansion, the haunting presence became undeniable. The house wasn't just haunted by spirits, it was actively feeding off their fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper from the walls, and every cold gust of wind seemed to push them further into the grip of terror. Emily had begun to hear voices, but they weren't just random whispers. They were personal. They were calling her by name, whispering terrible secrets about her past that no one could have known. She felt herself becoming weak, her resolve crumbling under the pressure. "They're trying to get to you," Sarah said, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. "They'll try to use your fears against you." But Emily didn't respond. She was too far gone, lost in the web of the house's manipulation. The whispers turned into screams, and every shadow seemed to come to life. At that moment, Emily was no longer in control of her own mind. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from above. James and Michael looked up in alarm. The noise came from the attic, the very place that had been locked for as long as anyone could remember. The door, once firmly shut, was now ajar, creaking in the wind. It was an invitation, a call to uncover the truth, to face the evil that had consumed this house. With trembling hands, Sarah pushed the door open, revealing a staircase leading up to the attic. As they ascended, the air grew even colder, the shadows thicker. Every step they took felt like they were sinking deeper into the heart of darkness, and with each step, the house seemed to grow stronger. At the top of the stairs, the attic was vast and empty, save for a few dusty furniture pieces and old trunks. But in the center of the room stood something that stopped them dead in their tracks, a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was cracked, but it wasn't the damage that caught their attention. It was the reflection. In the mirror, they saw not their own faces, but the faces of the Ashford family, still dressed in the clothing from the 1800s, their eyes hollow and filled with desperation. Their lips were moving, though no sound came from them. "Do you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the whispers became deafening, a cacophony of voices shouting, "Leave now or become one of us!" The mirror began to vibrate violently, shaking the walls around them. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor like deadly confetti. From the shards emerged the Ashford family. But these weren't the elegant figures from the portrait. They were something far worse, twisted, decayed corpses, their faces frozen in agony. They were no longer human, but revenants, creatures of darkness who had been cursed to haunt this house for eternity. The ground beneath their feet cracked, and the mansion itself seemed to come alive, its walls warping and stretching as if trying to swallow them whole. As the house shook violently, Sarah and her team realized that there was no escape. The mansion had come alive, and they were trapped in a nightmare they couldn't wake from. The Ashford family, now reduced to monstrous forms, stalked the team, their eyes glowing with malevolent energy. There was only one way out: destroy the source of the curse, the heart of Ashford House. But to do so meant confronting the darkest part of themselves, their deepest fears, and the very thing that had drawn them to the house in the first place. The house fought back with every ounce of its cursed power, But Sarah refused to give in. With a scream, she shattered the last piece of the mirror, severing the connection between the living and the dead. As the final shard fell to the ground, the mansion began to crumble, its walls collapsing in on themselves. But as they ran toward the door, they realized that not everyone would make it out alive. Some of them would remain trapped, their souls forever entwined with the house. As Sarah and the surviving team members ran into the thick, suffocating fog, they felt the ground trembling beneath their feet. The mansion, once an immovable, ominous presence, seemed to writhe like a living creature in its death throes. Its towering spires crumbled into ash, the twisted screams of the Ashford family echoing into the night, as if the curse itself were mourning its end. When they finally reached the edge of the woods, Sarah collapsed onto the damp ground, her chest heaving with exhaustion. Emily and James stood nearby, their faces pale and eyes wide with shock. For a moment, they stared back at the place where the mansion had once stood. Nothing remained but a hollow, swirling mist, as though the house had been swallowed by the earth. Emily broke the silence first, her voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't supposed to make it out." James, who had always been the skeptic, nodded mutely, his disbelief now fully shattered. He clutched a shard of the mirror he had picked up in the attic. It pulsed faintly in his hand, as though the energy of the curse still lingered. "What about Michael?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. Emily shook her head, tears streaming down her face. He stayed behind. He didn't want them to follow us." They all knew the truth. Michael hadn't sacrificed himself out of bravery, but because the house had claimed him. His soul was now part of Ashford House's twisted legacy. The aftermath weeks passed, and the survivors tried to return to their normal lives, but something had fundamentally changed. Sarah found herself unable to sleep, haunted by vivid nightmares of the Ashford family and the horrors they had endured. The screams of the revenants echoed in her mind, and she often woke up drenched in sweat, her heart racing as though she were still trapped in the mansion. Emily's psychic abilities became a curse rather than a gift. She saw fragments of the Ashford house wherever she went, in reflections, shadows, even in the faces of strangers. It was as though the house had imprinted itself on her soul, leaving behind a mark that could never be erased. James, however, took a different approach. He became obsessed with the shard of the mirror he had taken. He spent days studying it, hoping to understand the dark power that had consumed the Ashford family. His obsession grew to the point where he began to see figures in the shard's reflection. Familiar figures. Michael's face appeared one night, his expression twisted in pain and desperation. "You can't leave me here," the reflection said, its voice hollow and distant. "It's not over." Sarah received a call late one night from James, his voice frantic and filled with panic. "The shard? It's alive. It's showing me things I don't want to see. I think the curse isn't gone. It's still with us." Before Sarah could respond, the line went dead. She rushed to James's apartment, finding the door ajar. Inside, she was met with chaos. The walls were covered in cryptic symbols written in what looked like blood, and the mirror shard lay in the center of the room, glowing faintly. James was nowhere to be found. Sarah knew then that the house hadn't just consumed Michael. It had tethered itself to all of them, spreading its curse beyond the boundaries of its physical existence. The Ashford family's suffering wasn't over. It had only evolved, finding new ways to inflict its pain. The realization hit her like a cold wave. They were the new custodians of the curse, bound to carry it forward. As Sarah backed away from the glowing shard, she saw her reflection twist and distort into something unrecognizable. A dark, hollow version of herself, with eyes that glowed like embers. And then she heard it, faint but unmistakable. The whispers had followed her home. The Ashford house was gone, but its story was far from over. Its curse had spread like a virus, infecting those who dared to challenge its power. Sarah, Emily, and James had become unwilling vessels, carrying the darkness wherever they went. But the true horror was yet to come, because somewhere in some dark corner of the world, a new Ashford house would rise. Its walls hungry for fear, its shadows waiting to claim the next victims. And this time, there would be no escape.